into the mountains and organized guerrilla warfare. But then we decided we were too weak for that. So we found a boat the next day and got to the island of Corregidor, which was still holding out and did hold out for another month. The 3-mile stretch between Bataan and Corregidor was heavily mined and full of sharks. But God seemed to take us in his hand and guided us safely through the mines to Corregidor. And on Corregidor, because of my battle experience, I was assigned to the 4th Marines. I was the company commander at the last Battle of Corregidor. Now, on May the 6th, the Japanese began the shelling, the softening up process on Corregidor. Although they had been doing it for some time, they had 150 batteries set up on one side of Corregidor from the main island of Luzon, 75 batteries set up on the other side near Cavite. Now they were in position to shell us from both sides. They moved up their 240 millimeter guns, which was used for heavy sieges. These shells pierced the 16-foot concrete wall behind which were the heavy guns of Corregidor. Plus, with hundreds and hundreds of airplanes overhead, they would drop their bombs. We were receiving fire from both sides, and the big guns from Corregidor rolled back defiantly to the enemy. Every Japanese ship that came within 12 to 15 miles of Corregidor was sunk. The range of our guns was approximately 25,000 to 40,000 yards. The men manning these guns were under constant aerial bombing and artillery fire. These men stuck to their guns regardless of what happened. On several occasions, the powder magazines of these guns were hit, resulting in gigantic explosions that shook the whole island and nearly killed all personnel within the battery. Many of the men in my organization assisted in the rescue of personnel entrapped in these flaming tubes. For this, they received distinguished service citations and many other military citations for their outstanding bravery. 2 other men, whom I know from Perry County, were helping man these giant guns. They were Glenn Robertson and Patrick Walsh of St. Croix. I had the fortunate experience of seeing these men in action, and I cannot praise too highly their outstanding bravery. They were absolutely fearless. The families and friends of these 2 men will never have to be ashamed of their records. There are few who fought in this war who exceeded them. I never realized it then, but Patrick Walsh was later to give his life in a Japanese prison camp. I never had occasion to meet Charles Wilbur of Leopold, Indiana, who I later learned was also a prisoner in the same area as myself. I have seen movies they made of this bombardment of Corregidor, and it's almost like you're watching a movie and you wonder how a person could possibly survive. On April 29, 1942, which was the Emperor's birthday, began the real siege of Corregidor. All other artillery concentrations we had seen were child's play compared to what this one was. During the nighttime, the skies were so full of flame and explosions that you continuously read a newspaper if you had one. I afterward found out the streets of Manila, 40 miles away, were lighted up by this bombardment. We knew that we could not possibly hold out much longer. Day by day, our gun positions, coastal artillery, and anti-aircraft were being knocked out and rendered helpless. The bombardment never ceased, and I don't believe there was an hour passed when there was not a Japanese bombers overhead raining down death and destruction on us. As one American colonel remarked, it was like an X on a piece of a cardboard at one of those shooting matches back home, when some of those sharpshooters looked down the sights of that shotgun thinking the big piece of beef that they were going to take home, or that turkey they were going to roast. But actually, there were very few people killed, because if you were down in a foxhole of any kind, your chances of survival was very good. Our biggest desire was having something to eat. At first, we did have adequate water supply on Corregidor, but we still lacked adequate food. We were still hungry. Our food supply as in Bataan was rapidly diminishing. We were put on half rations, and again the pangs of hunger were taking a hold of us. At last, General Wainwright, whom I think is one of the most valiant fighting men the world has ever known, requested that all men serving on Corregidor take out a $10,000 life insurance policy, as he knew many of us would never get to see our families or home again. Then one night, a submarine slipped into Corregidor to bring us supplies and evacuate some sick and wounded. Then word was passed around for everybody to write their last and farewell letter home. This was the hardest letter I ever had to write. It certainly brought tears to my eyes when I realized this was probably the last letter I would ever send my new wife and family. Little did I know that letter would be lost at sea. I certainly know how a person in a death cell feels when he knows he's going to be hanged. All of us began taking our religion and prayer seriously. Then on May 4th, we received shocking news that our water supply had been bombed out, and we had only enough water to last for 3 more days. Our water was immediately rationed, and we were thirsty as well as hungry. Men were dying from disease and being killed and wounded every day. We finally resigned ourselves to the fate and placed our future in the hands of God. We never knew when our number was going to become up. The next artillery fire directed us was increasing in fury every minute. It was estimated close to 50,000 shells per minute were bursting on Corregidor. The whole island was shaking as it was engulfed by a gigantic earthquake, and many times I thought the whole island would sink into the sea. After 30 days of bombarding and 30 days of fighting, on the morning of May 6th, and after heavy shelling, I remember we had one long searchlight and reached out over Manila Bay. And just before daybreak, about 4 in the morning, this was at dawn, all you could see was nothing but landing barges full of troops coming straight at us. Well, with that knowledge of their coming and to see them massed and coming strong, all we could do was start shooting. We knew now that it was only a matter of hours until the end. Every man went into action. Every gun we had began firing. We had one 105 millimeter artillery gun left that was in operation, but we were soon about to run out of ammunition for it. All you could do was fire at point blank range. In other words, you didn't figure distance, you just aimed in the general direction. And you couldn't miss anything because when we fired, they were so close together and coming right at us, you hit something every time. As I watched these large red hot projectiles screaming through the air, I took great pride in the fact that I knew Patrick Walsh and Glenn Robertson were feeding those shells into the chambers of our big gun. Hundreds of barges were being blown out of the water. Above the roaring of the guns, we could hear the shouts and screams of the Japanese soldiers as death overtook them. But still they kept coming. It seemed there was no end to them. It was utterly impossible to get them all. Then they reached our beaches and came ashore. The 4th Marines were there to meet them. Then the real fight began. With overwhelming odds, they broke through our lines and started toward Malinta Tunnel, where General Headquarters is located. At 3 o'clock in the morning, my battalion was ordered to make a suicide attack and drive them off the island. We launched our attack and slowly began forcing them back. I remember when daylight came and looking out over the blood-red water of Manila Bay, between there and Bataan Peninsula, with thousands of dead Japs floating in the murky red-stained water. As far as the eye could see, only dead Japanese, and a continuous stream of landing barges with fresh troops still coming towards us. My heart sunk as I saw the hopelessness of the situation. All hope was gone. I remember my remarking to my battalion commander, I really believe we can walk all the way to Bataan on the dead bodies floating in the water. My battalion commander asked me to be ready to take over command in case of his death. I suggested that we hold the advance and hold what ground we now had until we got reinforcements. This he agreed to do. So we took up defensive positions and waited for the attack we knew would come as soon as fresh troops were landed, and it was not long in coming. Then followed 5 hours, the most fierce fighting I'd ever seen. We were greatly outnumbered. We were firing at point-blank range, throwing hand grenades at them, picking up the ones they were throwing at us before they exploded and throwing them back. Then they closed in with bayonets, clubs, rocks, and everything we could pick up. We beat off the first wave and waited for the second. It was now 11 o'clock in the morning, and word was sent for us to start withdrawing. As we started our withdrawal, the artillery at Bataan opened up on our lines. We had to continue our withdrawal right through all this hell. Upon reaching Malinta Tunnel, where we expected to make a last stand, my heart sank within me. Men began falling on the ground and crying like babies. During the meantime, Japanese Commander General Masahara Homa had actually sent word calling off the invasion. But meanwhile, the master commanding Japanese officer had landed with his tanks and his troops. We had nothing to fight tanks with, not a single anti-tank gun. But General Homa had sent word out for his troops to come home, thinking he couldn't take it. Well, he was wrong, but it wouldn't have mattered. We couldn't have repelled them. We were out of supplies. I think we had about 3 or 4 days of food left. Suddenly, General Wainwright had come out with a white flag. There before our eyes, I saw Old Glory being hauled to the ground and the large white flag of surrender being hoisted. Corregidor had fallen. I hurled my gun into the China Sea and sat down and cried. I looked up and saw our beloved General Jonathan Wainwright, going forward to accept our fate. His face was taut and grim. His eyes were filled with tears, and I could not help realize that this man was carrying the heaviest burden on his shoulders that any American general in the history of our country had to carry. I thank God that such a burden of responsibility did not rest on my shoulders. Now, when they captured this time, we were put inside the Malinta Tunnel on Corregidor, and they put tanks around the entrance with flamethrowers on them, and they forced General Wainwright to surrender all the troops in the Philippines, which he was forced to do. And that ended the war, as far as we were concerned. Little did I realize what the future had in store for us. If we had only known, I'm sure the Japanese would have never taken a live prisoner off that island. Again, we were tired, hungry, defeated army. We were disarmed and crowded into prison ships and taken to Manila. We were paraded down the street, the entire rank of sickly, unshaven, unkempt, dirty, filthy squads of soldiers. No chance to bathe or shave, and not much chance to eat. And they let the Filipinos look at us. The streets were lined with people. Everybody was crying. Many women fainted as they recognized their husbands and sweethearts in that long, struggling line. The Japanese thought this would humiliate us. It did, but it didn't do what they thought it would do, as they wanted to win the respect of the Filipino people, but it didn't do it. Young Filipino kids ran out in the line and marched and gave us cups of water, gave us cigarettes, and some of them waving and saying, "God bless America," in spite of the fact that they would have been killed if caught. And it got to the point where the Japanese couldn't stand it any longer. They made them all disperse and go home. We were then taken to Bilibid prison in Manila, and later to the prison at Cabanatuan in central Luzon. Here again, we met our old friends of Bataan. There were not many of them left alive. 3,000 of them died in 1 month of starvation, disease, and torture. They were nothing but living skeletons. I was down to 140 pounds compared to my usual weight of 170. I looked like a giant compared to them. I again thank God that I had been able to escape from that horrible death march of Bataan. In the prison camp, our food was nothing but rice, and very little of that. Conditions went from bad to worse. Malaria, beriberi, scurvy, peligria, dengue fever, yellow jaundice, amoebic and bacillary dysentery, elephantitis, diphtheria, and malnutrition were the most common diseases. And it was nothing unusual for a man to have all of them at one time. Needless to say, life was very short. There was absolutely no medicine available. Men were dying at the rate from 50 to 100 a day. Long, shallow graves were prepared daily, and the bodies were just thrown in crosswise, standing up or head first, all depending on the way they fell. The average body weight was about 60 pounds at death. They did not look like human bodies at all. Many were unrecognizable. There was no burying process except for a big hole in the ground, and each day you carried out the dead and threw them in this hole, then threw a little bit of dirt over them, then covered them up. The next morning you brought in more dead and put more dirt on top, and we filled these holes up, and we dug another hole. I don't know how many holes we dug. There were usually 400 or 500 buried in each hole. We tried to keep some record who was being buried in these mass graves, but there was no way of identifying these bodies. Many men in desperation took their own life. Their death lacked the glory of falling on the battlefield amidst the triumph of victory. But instead, the only form of death we could look forward to was the squalor and misery of torture and suffering until the human body was wasted away and the calmness of death overcame them. Indeed, it would have been a pleasure to die. That was one thing that we could always look forward to, that someday, soon we felt, we would not need to get up again. There seemed to be nothing more pleasant to the Japanese than to find an excuse to torture or cut off someone's head. This was great fun for them. One of their greatest delights was castration. Another was to take a man, pump water into his body until he could hold no more, then jump up and down in his abdomen until his stomach burst. Most of their burial practice was with live human bodies. The food was rice. We had 2 cups full a day. I hate rice today. I hate rice mainly because I never had enough of it. Every once in a while they gave us a weed that we made a soup out of. It tasted horrible. We had no salt, we had no seasoning of any kind, just plain rice, day after day after day. And half the times there were flies and maggots in the rice, but you ate it anyway because you had nothing else. On one occasion, we were given 3 chickens and 12 eggs for 600 men. Then in their newspapers, they bragged about the generosity of the Japanese Imperial Army giving chicken and eggs to the prisoners of war. Their apologies always ran like this: "We are very sorry, but you have killed many Japanese soldiers. You kept us from pushing our attack on Australia. You have resisted and refused to succumb to the kind intentions of the Son of Heaven, our beloved Emperor of Nippon. Therefore, we must annihilate you." It was at this time I again met Patrick Walsh, who had been sent to the hospital with dysentery. I received a note from him asking me to come to see him. I might add here that the place they called the hospital was where they sent you to die. A ticket to the hospital was usually only one way. You never came back. I immediately went to see Pat. For a long time I could not recognize him. He was nothing but skin and bones, as was typical of many. His elbows and knees were the largest part of his limbs. I saw once that his days were limited. I tried to encourage him by talking to his family and friends that we knew back in St. Croix. We talked of the Cunninghams, the Flanagans, the Huberts, the Caseys, the Esrys, the Sprinkles, the LaGranges, the Donnellys, and Kellys, and all other families around that area. At last we saw death was creeping on him, and he gave me his personal possessions, including his dog tags, to take back to his family if I should live to get back to the country. These I kept faithfully for several years, but at last I lost them, which I'll explain later. Then, when I saw that death was only a matter of minutes, I got the Catholic chaplain to administer last rites for him, and I'm sure his next place above was much happier than the one he had just left. Although his death lacked the glory of dying in battle, he gave his life just as freely for the cause of human freedom as any who fell before the salvo of enemy guns. His death was brave and honorable. He had given the last full measure of devotion. He made the supreme sacrifice for God, country, and the loved ones. At one point, we had enough men with dengue fever and diphtheria that broke out in the prison camp, and we had no medication. Somehow or other, through the grapevine, the Filipinos had attached word to Manila that there was enough dengue fever and diphtheria, and a Catholic priest in Manila, who was a German, an ally of Japan, came to the prison camp with diphtheria antitoxin. He went to the Japanese commander and asked him to please let him give this to the American doctors. The Japanese commander took the vials of the medicine and threw them on the ground and broke every one of them. His reply was, "I don't care how many died." The priest was taken out, and nobody ever heard of him again. Now, at this particular time, in October 1942, there was a request made for those who could walk and were strong enough to get on a detail. They would take 1,000 of us off to an island called Mindanao, 800 miles to the south. I thought the situation could not be any worse than what it was where I was, so I was one of the volunteers that went. Now, 1,000 of us were put in a ship, and the hole we were put in was only big enough for 100. 1,000 of us were rammed in there. It was nearly 100 degrees outside, and there was standing room only. We had no clothes. We had no shoes. Everything was gone. The only thing you had in the way of clothing was a G-string or your underpants. You manipulated around until you could stretch out by having everybody in a row when you were in to spread out their legs out and straddle between each other's legs and stretch there and lay for half an hour or so. Then it would be someone else's turn. And remember, there were no toilet facilities, and where you were laying is where your waist ended up, underneath of you. And a week or so, for it took us to get to 800 miles. By the time we got there, it